Welcome to Tilt, a podcast from the Santa Fe Art Institute. Artemisio Romero y Carver said, "We are a people born of a mass genocide, an ancestral wound that has never been resolved." In this episode of Unsettled, Alicia, Christian, and Diego look at how that wound still affects Nuevo Mexicanos today and the tools necessary to finally heal. This is episode 5, part 8, titled Cleanse.
You are listening to Unsettled.
Now you're talking sense.
Got this pine cone in my brain, got my eyes open, I'm sane. It's that wake up, that breaking free from them chains. It's that welcome to a new age, this right here for like a new wave. Third eye open wide, no flow ride, I
The key, so I always share that this work needs to be done in compassion, that we really need to come from a place of compassion. And Eduardo Duran, who does, talks about the soul wound of colonization and doing, real native psychology, counseling native peoples. He speaks of this often, that we need to be very aware of the ways that we act from our wounds of colonization, because that does show up as like revenge or enacting violence against our own peoples. And so that just feels on my heart to share, is that we always have to approach this work with humility and so much compassion and so much patience, and to acknowledge that there are going to be times that all of us make mistakes, because we're so indoctrinated by the colonial capitalist patriarchy. So there are ways that we will show up that that will be in the ways that we've been indoctrinated. And so really having compassion for folks, I don't think that we can do this work without that, coming from a place of love and patience, and that we have to do this work together, if we are to get onto the other side of this, creating the new world, a more just world, a better world, where we are healed from colonization. We need to be able to do this work together and to really have so much compassion and patience. And lastly, I think decolonizing is so important, right? Like we need to do the work to dismantle the systems we need to fight. And also, we need to leave room, we need to leave space to create the new world, to imagine the new world, to birth the new world. Because this is another way that colonization gets us. It depletes us and our energy through us just fighting it, right? And so, your story, my story, right? Like we lost ourselves through being in that system. We lost our health, and that happens to so many activists, of being burnt out or of dying of cancer. Like this work comes with so much side effects, like harm to our bodies, to our minds, our spirit. And so I also want to share with folks that, and this has been the image that's been coming to mind, of like seeing decolonizing and creating the new world on like these scales, and almost like the energy of water, of like sometimes it's going to tip towards fighting, because that's a very real thing. We still live in this reality, but also leave some space and times for the creating the new. What does that look like? Yes, we want to decolonize. And then what? What is it that we want? What do we want to create? And this is where we need to leave room for rest. This is why healing is important, because we cannot create from a state of depletion, right? We cannot even imagine from a state of depletion, because we're just surviving. And so seeing that rest, our wellness, as our birthright and also as a portal to creating the new earth, right? Leaving space for that, I think, is so important as well.
Growing up in northern New Mexico and having gone to high school in Española, I bore witness to the symptoms of long-standing colonial wounds: addiction, melancholy, self-harm, domestic violence, internalized racism, and anti-indigeneity. I remember massive drug busts, children my age growing up with grandparents because their own parents were dead or in jail, and a sense that after having been devalued for so long by others, those same children grew up believing their own future was all but decided. I didn't know just how much hundreds of years of the past were bubbling up into the present, each generation's burden layered onto the next like heavy sediment. In Dr. Rocio Rosales Meza's words, when trauma doesn't get healed in the first generation, the grief, anxiety, and depression only amplifies with each generation to follow. Whether we are aware or not, our bodies, minds, and spirits bear that burden.
And so I absolutely believe that colonization is a wound that we carry as you know, coming from a lineage of peoples that were colonized. That is a wound that originated with our ancestors that were first colonized, and that we continue to carry through intergenerational trauma. So if folks really understand, if we think back to our ancestors who had first contact with European settlers and what that felt like, of course, the genocide and the violence and all of that, but even for them to understand psychologically what that did to our peoples, what it must have felt like to see the land, your mother, violently abused, right? And the impact that that had on your spirit, the impact that that had on your psyche, right? The immense amount of grief and loss that perhaps that we know they experience and that we carry ourselves. I think that's so important to remember, because I think often when we talk about decolonizing, we sort of talk about it, which is important. We talk about it from a historical perspective, and that's important. But I think it's important to also look at it from a spiritual and psychological perspective. What was the impact of that? And how did that feel? How did that feel in their spirit? How did that feel in their bodies? And then to acknowledge that because of intergenerational trauma, those are things that we still carry as coming from a lineage of colonized peoples. And we absolutely carry resilience, and we carry strength, and we carry the medicine and wisdom of our ancestors. And we also carry these wounds.
Dr. Rosales Meza is a Chicana seer, medicine woman, decolonial healer, and former academic. As a first-generation Mexican-American born to immigrant parents, Dr. Rosales Meza relayed her own story of leaving the toxic realm of academia behind as a result of health crisis. I could relate. The immigrant work ethic, she told me, was itself a capitalist trauma imprinted onto people so deeply that they had begun to believe being exploited was a strength. It's one of the many ways white supremacy continues to exert power, she said, to compound the past, or what Eduardo Duran called the soul wound left by colonization, with our current moment.
The generations, and this gets us to what colonial mentality is. Colonial mentality is a manifestation of that, right? Part of the mechanics of colonization, of how it was, colonization was economic, political, social, cultural, psychological, right? All of these things. And it is the ideology of colonization, right? How we have been indoctrinated to believe that whiteness is superior, and Black, Indigenous folks of color, our cultures, our knowledge, all of these things are inferior. It is that ideology that has allowed it to perpetuate, to exist for all these years, right? For hundreds of years. And so that gets us to colonial mentality, how Black, Indigenous folks of color have internalized that we are inferior, right? That we deserve less than, that we are not worthy of being well, that we are not worthy of taking up space, that we are a problem, right? Like those are, I see that in my community too. And even as you were speaking, all of that just hurts my heart, because this manifests in very real ways in our communities, and they may not be able to identify, connect it to, I'm feeling this way because of colonization, right? Like, and that's how intergenerational trauma works. They may not be able to identify the source, but they know that they are feeling unwell, that they feel maybe even hopeless, right? Or that they even feel lost. I think that's the feeling of being lost is such a common experience for Black, Indigenous folks of color, particularly, I want to say, for Black and Indigenous folks, that feeling of being lost, because we, you know, African folks were taken from their lands, and Indigenous folks, their lands were taken from them. And we are very deeply connected to our lands. That is when our lands are harmed, it is as if we are harmed. It's our mother that is harmed. And so that experience of being lost and fragmented and separated has a very real impact, right? It's a soul loss that happens. It's trauma. And so that shows up as anxiety or depression. If we use psychological terms, it shows up in that ways. um, it shows up in self-medicating, right? So like, um, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, to soothe, right, the pain that they may be feeling. And that's very common um, in Mexican culture and Indigenous culture, like because of the original wound. And also, interpersonal violence, domestic violence is very common as well. And this also stems from learning that we are inferior. When violence is done to us and our peoples, we then enact that violence to our own families, to our own children, right? And so here is where I what I feel is also wanting to come through is that colonization has many layers, and I think patriarchy is also a part of it, right? It is femmes and women that are most impacted, right? And queer folks that are most impacted by this violence.
In the very first episode of Unsettled, I posed this conundrum. Who are we after all? At least monuments were objects, solid and fixed. They were tangible. They could be cast onto the concrete, yanked into the ocean, and leveled. But the problem was our identities aren't so definite. Whether original inhabitants, settlers, or of deeply mixed descent, the identities that make up this place are far more fluid than public monuments could ever mirror. I was wondering in myself what histories had been forgotten or erased, what identities remained latent and others manifest. Who was I and who was my community? While we have to some degree answered the question of who we are, or at least made an earnest attempt, we haven't quite broached another related issue: how forms of voluntary amnesia and forced erasure of complex histories and identities have contributed to a sense of profound loss, hopelessness, displacement, and perpetual searching, how a lack of wellness continues to persist, and how self-care, from a place of radical love, doesn't exist. That the Soldiers' Monument became a thing onto which we could transfer centuries of pain and ideas about who we thought we were doesn't seem so surprising. In fact, it's easier to do that than to face the shadows. In this episode of Unsettled, we look squarely at those shadows and how the ancestral wounds that Dr. Rosales Meza speaks of manifest. We also look at some of the ways our communities, here and elsewhere, carry the medicine and resilience needed to heal. So clean up your altar and get ready for a good limpia.
Because I work a lot with ancestral healing, and I noticed that maybe energetically we have almost like a vortex that is open right now. Because right now we are in since 2019, 2020, and 2021, this year is these 3 years, this period when Cortez arrived to the continent. So he arrived to Cozumel, the island,
500 years ago.
500 years ago in 1519. And in 1521, exactly 500 years ago, was when they were fighting. And it's when they conquered the biggest empire in the continent, the beginning, or the huge colonization, right?
Yeah, that gives me like chills. I remember actually when we were working on the Martinez episode, finding the date and having this realization like there is something energetically happening. But
it is because it's like we move in cycles. So I think this big cycle of 500 years is bringing like the pain of the colonization, and it's not just for the descendants of the indigenous people, it's for everyone. Like also the descendants of the colonizers, they carry a lot of pain and guilt because of what happened or what their ancestors did, and that's why they cannot talk about it. It's so painful that it's like it's like better avoided and don't even touch it. And the descendant, whoever is more connected with the indigenous part, is more like this desire to heal. Because what happened with that, well, everything was broken. It was the beginning of like the world, the indigenous world was broken. The spirituality, the way of living, the food, the wise people, most of them were killed, and a lot of the practices were prohibited. The Spaniards brought the alcohol because even here there was some alcoholic drinks, like for example el pulque from the agave and other that they were making with corn, but was only for ceremonial use, and only the elders were able to drink it. So they brought it on purpose. It was part of the colonization. So they brought their own, and they noticed that because the spirituality was broken and the rules were broken, everybody was allowed to drink. So the alcoholism that we see and the drug addiction that we can see, all these addictions, are coming from that, the process of colonization. And if we see like the indigenous communities, the Latinos communities, addictions are very strong. And well, we see that here in Española is one of the better examples to observe what's happening. Like all the pain, not taking responsibility because it's so painful.
Hernan Cortez, Veronica Iglesias told us, began sailing to the coast of the Yucatan from Hispaniola, or present-day Dominican Republic, in February of 1519. In March, he arrived in what is now Tabasco, where he met Marina, or La Malinche, who eventually became his interpreter, whether by force or survival, and bore him a child named Martin. La Malinche, mother of the first mixed indigenous child, and a woman now often referred to as una vendida, or traidora, was at the crossroads of that moment.
Just imagine the huge impact and trauma that the indigenous people were experiencing in the period of colonization when they people from other parts of their planet were coming and taking everything. And one example, and also sometimes we want to bring or what we know now, that our thoughts or way to perceive the world to those times. Like I'm thinking in La Malinche, no, La Malinali, who was the woman who was translating for Cortés. So she was a super powerful woman, smart. She was able to speak at least 3 or 4 languages. Super smart. So a lot of people still blame her because she is la traidora. But it's like we are seeing from our eyes right now. But at that time, she was part of a community that was oppressed by the Mexicas or the Aztecs.
To bring this home, this time, just over 500 years ago, began the first of many world-breaking moments, apocalypses you might say, where spiritual systems were broken, land was made into an extractable resource for a colonial power that existed an ocean away, and women like La Malinche were forced to survive in whatever way possible. Cortez's eventual conquest of Tenochtitlan took place over the course of 3 years, with the final capture of the city in August of 1521. Now, Veronica said while she made Christian and I tea from a combination of dried plants, is the perfect time to confront the shadow. From her kitchen table, and joined by her chihuahua Panchito and her cat Luna, she told us that the portal is open.
And it's in our DNA. The trauma is there. So I think in this is a very precious time because we have the opportunity to heal a lot of things. Because of this energetic vortex, it's a huge opportunity for whoever is ready, for whoever wants to jump and confront the pain and confront the shadow. We can heal a lot. Because this energetic vortex can support us. So I think it's perfect right now for whoever wants to do the work.
That's a lot.
Yes, it is
That's
a
heavy.
lot.
Trauma, Veronica said, is in our DNA. In terms of science, biological factors impact the expression of genes, and these epigenetics can be passed down from one generation to another. I think, for instance, of diabetes, which is incredibly prevalent in my family, lurking in individual bodies until it fully manifests in adulthood, like an inescapable scourge. Colonization and the continual disruptions with our food culture, as only one instance, forced physiologies to change in ways that are still alien. That rupture exists within myself, distant and far off, yet close, too close. Trauma, of course, goes beyond Western understandings of science, epigenetics, public health, and biomedicine, to the furthest reaches of our psyches, spirits, and bodies, to places within ourselves that we don't even know exist. It's time to clean the wound.
Seeing the pain, just being able to see the pain. I went through a lot of different pain, so I know pain, right? I know pain. I feel like I can recognize pain, right? I feel like I can understand pain. You know, if somebody tells me, man, this is what's going on, I'm like, you know, I totally understand that, right? Even though it might be a different situation, the pain is the same, right? The situations might be different, but the pain is the same. At the end of the day, pain is pain. Is how do we get over that pain? How do we begin to heal, right? How do we begin to allow whatever it is that we're going through or what we've gone through, especially generational like that? How do we nurture it to where the future of individuals don't have to go through that anymore? They shouldn't have to go through that anymore. You know, we've been like, when it comes to the whole Oñate thing, that's been 490 some years or something like that. I mean, do the math, you know? And it's like, why do we have to keep going through that, you know? I believe that our people deserve to be healed. I believe that our people can only grow from healing, right? Never forgetting what happened. I'm not saying let's forget what happened, never forget what happened, but let's use it as a tool for positivity. Let's use it as a tool to grow, to propel ourselves to another level, right? Sometimes we hang on to things, and sometimes that can do more damage, you know. And so just trying to find that balance, right? And again, it all goes back to understanding pain because of the lifestyle that I've lived, knowing the pain that I've not only brought myself, but more than the pain that I brought myself, the pain that I brought others, my mom, my brother, my kids, my ex, the people who used to believe in me, and all of a sudden it got to a point in time where they're like, what happened to this guy, right? What happened to this guy? When I would talk to them and I look at them in their eyes, I'd see that pain in their eyes. Yeah, I'll be able to absorb that pain just by looking in a person's eyes. Like I saw that, I felt it, you know. And it's like I don't want that to be a part of everyday life for the future. You know, if I can do, the way I look at it is, if I can do something today that I'm not even gonna, or my kids aren't even gonna benefit from, but 2 or 3 generations down the road, it's gonna finally settle, and they're gonna be able to benefit from something, that a seed that I planted today, that I've done my job. Because it's not about seeing the effects today or while I'm alive or while a person's alive. It's that you do it for the future, and that's it, right? You do it for the future, and that's it.
For some 3 decades, Española has suffered one of the highest rates of drug-induced deaths in the United States, with opioids, including heroin, taking the most lives. New Mexico on the whole had the 15th highest rate of deaths by drug overdose in 2018. Ralph Martinez, who knows pain, like deep pain, said his addiction period lasted a total of 11 years.
You get into like these states of depression, you get into this state of hopelessness, and that actually sucks you deeper into addiction. That feeling that you've lost everything, that feeling that you've screwed things up, that feeling of loss, that feeling, and so it's kind of like a catch-22, you know. And so I became homeless in 2006. I lived underneath, there's a bridge in Espinela by the Johnny's Auto Parts. I lived underneath that bridge for probably a good year. I lived underneath the bridge by the La Cocina, which isn't too far from that bridge, for some time. I lived in the Bosque area behind the Walmart for quite some time. I lived in abandoned buildings, abandoned homes, things of that sort. That was my way of life. Of course, hustling to get what I needed, and there was many different things that I did that I'm not proud of, that I did in order to survive, I guess what you can say. And it's that vicious cycle, right? It's that vicious cycle that once you get into that cycle, it's hard to get off. You feel like you start to dig a ditch or dig a hole, and then you all of a sudden you feel like you're so far in the hole, you feel like, why am I going to stop digging? You know, I'm just going to keep digging until I can't dig anymore. I've OD'd twice in my addiction period. The first time that I OD'd was when I first became homeless, and it was actually the first time I ever did heroin. Before that, it was just always cocaine. I went from snorting it to smoking it to eventually shooting it up. And when I first became homeless, there was a friend of mine who I used to party with, and we would smoke a lot of crack cocaine, a lot of Ready Rock. And whenever we would finish with the Ready Rock, he would always pull out his syringe and he would fix himself a dose of heroin, and he would do that, and he would like calm down and be able to go to sleep. And I was always like, oh my God, we need more, you know. So he had given me a syringe with some heroin in it, and I was super depressed because I had lost my whole family, my self-identity, my life, I felt like. And so I intentionally overdosed the first time. And so I went to this place that not too many people ever go. It was out by the river. And I did what I did. I had never shot up before, but I had seen it be done 100 million times. And so I was like, okay, I think I can do that, right? And so I did it, and I OD'd, and I woke up in the back of an ambulance, and I found out afterwards, they had brought me back with Narcan, and I found out afterwards what happened was that I overdosed. I went out, and these 2 individuals had showed up to that spot I guess they were there a couple of days before, and they had lost a telephone. So they had went to go see if they had left the telephone over at that spot. They found me underneath the tree. I was purple and wasn't responsive. And so they tried waking me up, apparently, and they couldn't. And so they called 911.
Ralph is incredibly open about his addiction. Within minutes of meeting, he told us not to be afraid to ask questions, even describing how he wouldn't shower for months at a time, how he was homeless, or whenever his mom would go look for him along the main drag. He was so embarrassed that he would often run away. His past was an open book. There were rehabs too, in Florida, California, Farmington, and Alcalde. But it wasn't until 2012 that he was able to get clean. In 2017, Ralph, who identifies as Hispanic based on his surname and his mom's maiden name, Quintana, was the last person to play the role of Juan de Oñate in the Española fiestas, before that role was officially retired.
So the role actually came knocking at my door.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a phone call one day saying that I had been nominated and to play Juan de Oñate, and if I would consider accepting that nomination. And my first thought was, what? The fuck are you talking about? Like, what? Like, that blew my mind, bro. I'm like, wait a minute. Who nominated me for this? Like, and why? You know, it was like blew my mind because I knew growing up that I knew the fiestas. I knew that there was somebody had played Juan de Oñate, and I knew that Juan de Oñate was like this guy who first came here and settled or something like that. I don't even know. And I knew that there was like and I knew that there was like, I don't know, it seemed to be like a good time, but there was like a reason behind it. I just never really knew the reason. I guess never really had interest in the reason. You know, I just never did. So when it came knocking at my door, I was like, wait a minute, what? And I knew by and this was in 2017 that I played Juan de Oñate. So by 2017, I knew that whoever played Oñate was kind of like the face of the community for a period of time. I didn't even know at the time what the period of time was. And so so when they came knocking at my door and asking me, I told them that I needed some time to think about it, right? And so I started doing a lot of research, and it was really, really cool because I feel like I tapped in a lot to my culture, my heritage, my past, you know, my extended past. And I did a lot of research on Juan de Oñate, where he came from, why he came from, where he came from. I read up a lot about his character, about the whole incident that happened at Acoma Pueblo. And after Acoma Pueblo, and it was just really heavy in my heart, right?
Part of that research involved reading about the massacre at Acoma Pueblo, when Don Iwani, who'd married the great-granddaughter of Hernan Cortez, and his men killed some 500 Acoma men and 300 Acoma women in retribution for the death of his nephew, also named Juan. Ralph described Oñate's nephew, who stormed into Acoma demanding food and shelter, as baboso. How would you like it if someone came into your house? So Acoma Pueblo, he continued, while wiping his hands, took care of the problem. When Oñate found out, his love for his nephew, as Ralph described it, turned into hate for Acoma Pueblo. So before he took on the role, Ralph met with elders from Oquewenge and Santa Clara Pueblo.
After going and sitting with the two neighboring, I learned that they weren't even against the event itself. It's how the event was portrayed. And they had told me about the requests that they had made for years, right? And their requests they felt were being ignored for whatever reason, and that's what brought more animosity towards the event, right? And it's like two wrongs never make a right type of deal. And so I thought about it, and I said, okay, if I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do this according to my heart, and I'm gonna do this in a way that I can leave at the end of the year, because it's a 1-year commitment. At the end of the year, knowing that I did what I could to plant seeds of positivity, right? And so I did a lot of different things within that year. One of the things that I did was I chose to ride, and that's one of the things that they were asking is all we've ever asked, Ralph, is that they ride without the sword and without the helmet. They said because back in the 1500s, when you saw a group of conquistadors riding in with their helmets on, that meant that they were ready for war. And when they had their swords drawn or even their swords on them, they were ready for war. So just those two items alone to us represents war, and the war represents everything else that took place, all the bloodshed that took place, right? I saw that. I saw that. I agreed, and so I did the whole event without my sword and without the helmet, um, and 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 then we started the Espanol Community Matanza. Me and my cuadrilla. It's the group of people that I chose to ride with me. We had 13 individuals that I had riding with me, and it was a group of individuals who had a shared heart and shared vision, shared focus. And we started another community event within that event that gave back to the community. It was the Espanol Community Matanza, and that was a really good thing. And when we got to the end of our time with the Santa Fe Fiestas, is the very last fiestas. That's one of the most controversial, and it was super controversial that year. And the police even wanted to go in and escort us and surround us with police, and I'm like, no, we're not gonna do that. Like, no, we will not ride with police escort. And the only thing that we'll do, and I did sit down and talk to my guys. I said, what do you guys want to do? I mean, I won't ride with police escort. I said, if we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this. We're gonna do this the right way, or we're not gonna do it at all. It's up to you guys. And so they all agreed that we would ride. They all wanted to ride. I said, okay, cool. And then it was super cool because this really big thing happened 2 days before the event, with the controversy that was happening. And so the morning of the event, I remember waking up and I was just thinking about everything, and I told we had a native scout, right, on our team, and so that morning we went to the stables and we were getting all our horses and getting everything ready to go up to Santa Fe for the fiestas. And Desmond, his name is Desmond, he's from Okiawinga, and he's young, he was 16 at the time. And even with Desmond, before, when I asked Desmond if he would be my native scout, and he said yes, I said, before you answer, let's talk about this, right? Because I want you to know what you're getting into, right? It's not just a yes, I'll do it, and it's for, pageantry, and it's deeper, way deeper than that. And so we talked about it, and so he knew what he was getting himself into when he agreed to do it, right? So I pulled Desmond to the side that morning before the Santa Fe Fiestas. I said, I have an idea, Des. I said, how did you feel about you and I walking in the Santa Fe Fiestas? Usually everyone's on their horse. Everyone is on a horse. They're on horseback, and that's how they ride through, right? And I said, how do you feel about you and I walking in the Santa Fe? And we can let all these other guys ride. I said, as a symbol that we walk the same path, that we go through the same struggles, and we can do it together. We do it side by side. I said, it'll give us a chance to interact with each other, with everybody watching, or we do acts of love and peace, right? Togetherness.
As I think back, I'm not sure how Ralph meant this phrase, walking the same path. While he admits not knowing much about his family tree, I wonder whether this statement could have implied that we are not only neighbors of Native communities, but after centuries of living side by side, also relatives. This remains an open question, whether forgetting this fact has also contributed to an ongoing sense of trauma. For part of forgetting involves erasing parts of ourselves that would connect us to our native kin. And self-erasure is a form of violence.
And this is the violence to self, right? The violence to self and myself too. I mean, most Mexicans, Chicanos, are mixed indigenous peoples. And that is a whole conversation on its own. There's so many layers there. But what I believe that blood quantum is colonial, and I believe that it is important as being descendants of indigenous peoples. Like my in my family, I see I'm a lighter skinned Chicana. My father, my grandfathers, like all of the people around me in my family, I can see those that are indigenous, you know, and so there's so many layers there of being quote unquote mixed indigenous, and also I think even that mixing, you know, something about that, you know, it relates to the blood quantum and of like giving power over to whiteness, that you did take away who I am, you know. And so especially as folks like me that are lighter skinned, it is important to acknowledge the privilege that comes with that, absolutely, but it doesn't make you any less indigenous, you know, because I think that's giving power over to the colonizer. And that's a whole another conversation in itself, but I felt like called to bring that in for the folks that are not able to or have learned to sort of hide or hate that indigenous part of themselves, who they are. That is violence to self, you know. And I do have folks in my family that do struggle with that feel that they still have to distance themselves from that. And that also manifests in so many ways of literally, you know, hating self, abusing self. And that looks like um, you know, drug and alcohol abuse, perhaps. That looks like also abusing and exploiting your body, you know, and this is also the capitalist trauma, which is colonial trauma of like self-care doesn't exist, you know.
For untold reasons, that pain is both diffuse and extreme. So much so that when we attempt to paper it over, we can't. I even think of the name of Española, Little Spain, a town located squarely between many pueblos and named in 1900. How is it that we can continue to think of this place as a medieval castle encircled by a moat, supposedly unbreachable by other bloodlines? But denial only begets more denial. Pain only begets more pain. And trauma only begets more trauma. So buried is that trauma that it's sometimes impossible to identify the source. You only know it by its symptoms.
You know, you said pain is pain, but like, I know there's pain in our communities. Yeah. And then I try and figure out, well, what is that pain? You know, I'm like, I can sense it, I can feel it, I know it's there, and then I'm like, but what is it?
Yeah, and it's not like stubbing your toe type of pain, you know. It's that inner core of your soul. I don't know why this is happening type of pain, you know. It's deeper than physical pain, you know, way deeper than physical pain. And I think, you know, it has a lot to do with traumas, you know. Somebody's trauma, the energy of somebody's trauma can transfer to somebody else, and they don't even know that they've received it until they're like feeling all messed up, you know. It's what kind of energies are we dispersing to others, you know.
We disperse the energy of one person's trauma onto someone else, Ralph said. But what about our public spaces? When participants from the Española fiestas participated in the Santa Fe fiestas in that particularly fractious year, he said the energy there was hate on hate. Why do we have to do this to each other, he asked. Remember Diane Reyna's retelling of her observance of the fiestas? Those performances too give power over to whiteness. So do monuments to Juan de Oñate, Diego de Vargas, and even the Soldiers' Monument. In fact, these monuments aren't celebrating figures like Daniwani and de Vargas, or even soldiers as individuals. They are celebrating power and dominance. And when folks from our community say that that's their history, they are also giving power over to whiteness. Those spaces, just as much as anything else, need a good limpia too.
So yeah, so Cleanse was really birthed in the middle of the quarantine during the protest for the continued fight and movement towards racial justice. And so it was really interesting because that Cleanse was more of a rapid response. You know, I just spoke about like just how involved I am with the community and conversations that lead into a final piece. But really, Cleanse was just something that I say the universe helped bring the team, the Cleanse team together. It was something that I really thought of in terms of like, sorry, that was that noise again. So my phone is shut, so hopefully it won't come back up again. So yeah, so what I wanted to say is that with Cleanse, it was really about responding, or in a sense it was like our call to action. And when I say our, um so just to kind of paint the picture, in it was June 2020, and I had been in my house without really leaving my house since March, mostly because my son is immunocompromised and my parents are at high risk. So I, took several months to kind of figure out what I needed to do and adjust because of the of COVID, and then was really just getting into back into my projects and in my work, but really avoiding any type of like just in-person contact, which is really hard, right, for me. And and so I had been in my home for close to over 80 days. And come June, there was already a process in place of removing and painting over the what was the Frank Rizzo mural on 9th and Montrose in my neighborhood, in the market, or what most people label as the Italian market. If you're from the community, most of us say 9th Street. But the market itself was home to this mural, which is located on 9th and Montrose. And this mural had been in our community for over 20 years, and it was actually the most defaced mural in all of Philadelphia. Philadelphia has over 3,000 murals, and this particular mural was the most defaced mural because the image of that was depicted was of Frank Rizzo, who was a former police commissioner and former mayor, who was Italian American, who, in the eyes of a lot of the Italian American community, they saw him as someone who made it, right? Someone who was descendant of Italian immigrants, born and raised in South Philadelphia, and made it all the way up to becoming mayor. Unfortunately, and there's difficulty in speaking about Rizzo because there exists the community that sees him as a symbol of pride and a symbol of of um, of joy and pride, right? In that sense. And then there's another group which really identifies his image and his actions, that caused a lot of pain and violence towards both Black and Brown communities, specifically Black communities in Philadelphia. Um, and so I grew up in this neighborhood, and when I learned about Rizzo as a child, he was presented to me as a hero.
Michelle Angela Ortiz is an artist based in Philadelphia and former SFAI resident. In June of 2020, when cities across the nation were confronting monuments to state-sanctioned violence, a mural of Frank Rizzo, located on 9th Street and Montrose, was finally painted over. Many people of color who'd been advocating for the mural and another statue to Rizzo to come down celebrated. Rizzo, a famed police commissioner, was known for urging voters in Philadelphia to vote white back in the 1970s. He was also known as the face of a brutal police force against Philadelphia's Black community, and responsible for the MOVE bombings when the Philadelphia police bombed members of a Black liberation movement. A muralist among other practices, Michelle has painted large prismatic murals of women, children, immigrants, and LGBTQ icons. One mixed media artwork spelled the word Libertad in massive letters and was dedicated to families detained at the Berks Detention Center. The whole installation was made with over 1,000 handcrafted paper flowers. Cleanse, the namesake of this podcast episode, was a rapid response to the end of an era, an end of Frank Rizzo's hold over public space.
Monument Lab was part of those conversations in 2017, or actually collecting different ideas from the community, sourcing the different ideas around what could replace this Rizzo statue, right? So not just speaking to its removal, but thinking about what would replace this statue here in this space. And so I'm just kind of building the framework of cleanse because of the fact that the removal of the statue, of the Rizzo statue, was very much tied into the removal of the mural on 9th and Montrose, where the first cleanse projection happened. And so, but I also want to acknowledge that these are two different spaces, like physical spaces, right? So where the statue existed was in the municipal building in Center City, on a city building. And the mural was painted on this wall, deeply embedded in this community of immigrant families, or a market built by immigrant families and labor and love. And that's the community I belong to, right? And I felt that what was necessary, and when I heard that the wall was going to be painted over um, by the mural arts program, after deciding, we always knew, I think when I say we, just Philadelphians knew that once a statue came down the wall, the mural was going to come next. And so we already knew that that was going to happen. And so it did. And there was a lot of tension, which I think there's still tension, but there was a lot of tension during that time because, mind you, we were still having the protests happening. There was a lot of police presence. There was our own cops and city making decisions to tear gas peaceful protesters. So a lot of this, the violence was really coming on the side of the cops in Philly. And so there was also armed guards, even within our own community. And part of it was because of that particular mural, knowing that it was going to be painted over.
Just days before Mayor Weber had promised to take down the Soldiers Monument this summer here in Santa Fe, the National Guard was deployed to Philadelphia in response to protests over the murder of George Floyd by a white police officer. At the same time, 23 states and the District of Columbia had also deployed the National Guard. In all, a staggering 17,000 soldiers, the same number of active duty troops stationed in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan combined.
And so there was tensions were high, and even folks were texting me in, like, saying we should do this, let's do this on this wall. And I spent like a good week just de-escalating um petitions or painting on the wall, or people wanting to just take action quickly, mostly because I was fearful, right, in terms of like all of this tension building up. And also, I live here in my community, so I didn't want anything to erupt and to escalate and someone would be harmed. Um, so in June, the mural was painted over, and that was the moment that I stepped out of my house and I walked with my 6-year-old son, with my husband and my parents, and we walked towards the wall because I really wanted to witness what had just happened. And it was just something really powerful. Again, mind you, there was mixed feelings, but for me personally, I saw it as a new opportunity, right? I saw it as not an erasure, but this is a new opportunity to engage in this space, and a new way, an opportunity to define who we are, right here in this space, in this community.
That opportunity, as Michelle put it, birthed Cleanse, a series of projections made by her and a team of artists on a blank wall where the Frank Rizzo mural once was emblazoned. And it included images, messages, color, and light to support collective healing. It was necessary, she said, to focus the imagery on the people of the market, where she came from.
So for me, cleanse became that call of action, and just believing in, I think what's really important at this moment that we're living in the midst of chaos, in the midst of unrest, and what I've been trying to do to kind of keep my nervous system at ease is just reminding myself of my ancestors and reminding myself of the strategies that they have put forward to survive. And a huge part of that for me, cleanse, was this visual cleansing of this space, like utilizing light and the imagery of water, the imagery of prayer, images of people from our community that not enacting or victims of violence, um, but just are joyful and present and beautiful, right? So utilizing that imagery to be able to really wash away any negative energy that really was held for 25 plus years in this space and on this wall.
Like what to do to start the healing? I really think that everything starts with the individual, the desire to confront the pain and go. There's different tools to liberate the pain, different techniques. There's one, it made me think in Tezcatlipoca, that is a deity. It means the smoked mirror or the obsidian mirror. And this deity invite us to see ourselves in an obsidian mirror. And this the shadow, things that we don't like about ourselves, things that are painful, things that we don't want to see, but we know are there. So it's when we have this deep desire to go to the pain, open the wound, because the wound is there, it's infected. So it's like opening and clearing it is going to be super painful, but it is. I think that's one of the ways, the beginning, and then when more individuals are really healing, and we can connect more heart to heart, and that doesn't mean that the healing will end. It will continue, but doing it together and opening spaces where people can express. Because something that I perceive here, again, like I feel that the circles are very close. So only if everybody agree, that's fine. But and it's happening in the country, right, and in the world, maybe. Like if somebody disagrees, like, no, you are not welcome here. Mm-hmm. But I think that's part of the confrontation, the shadow, like why something is triggering me, like something that somebody's telling, why is bringing that anger, whatever. So it's that opening, like brave, courageous spaces, healing spaces, and do that because nobody's going to do, or like how I say it, like everybody gets to heal first, like individually, and then we can expand that to the community. Because, like for example, like with my experience working with people in recovery for all these years, you can see the families trying to help them, right? Like doing everything, put them in special places where they can heal. But if it's not deep desire, if the deep desire is not coming from the person, nothing is going to happen. Nothing, like nothing is going to change. The family is going to be spending a lot of money, but nothing is going to. It's just deep desire to do the changes, and it is intense, but I think it's one of the ways.
Tezcatlipoca, Veronica said, is the deity of the smoking mirror. Veronica's been in the area for around a decade, working with local gente to heal ancestral wounds, especially those that manifest as addiction. She paused thoughtfully before saying just how appropriate the deity might be for this very moment. Included in the Jade Oracle cards Veronica created to aid in divining one's destiny, Tezcatlipoca appears when there's usually conflict afoot. There are multiple ways to read the cards, but as the description for this particular card says, Tezcatlipoca is a reminder that illusion often obscures the truth, and he challenges you to be strong and face your own truth. After you clear the smoke, the mirror's image will also be clear.
To get away from all of the craziness, our elders are encouraging it. Our parents are saying, you got to leave, you got to get out of here if you want to become something, just because there's no opportunity. And, for me, it was like this escape, trying to escape heroin addiction, trying to escape violence, gang violence, physical, sexual violence, which so many of us are victims to. And that's a reality. Intergenerational sexual violence is real in northern New Mexico. Um, Physical violence, death, um, alcoholism, heroin addiction, cocaine addiction, and we're pushed to leave, and they call it the northern New Mexico exodus, right? It's a phenomena, but really, what it is the impact of colonialism, the impact of human, in this case, white supremacy, and how Eurocentric ideas has really worked to erase our core cultures. When I left, I didn't know a lot about who I was. What I knew is we were Spaniards, even my mom, even my grandmother in our family tree. The first page of our family tree says our ancestors got off two boats, and our ancestors were the Spaniards. So that was like what I thought. And I left this community with this like anti-indigenous, anti-Mexicano mentality that is so woven into, and it's that trauma, right? That historical trauma, that I didn't even really know who I was.
Joseluis Ortiz, like so many norteños, was born with a false sense of Spanish identity, itself built on anti-indigeneity and anti-Mexicanness. And like so many norteños, he attempted to escape a community mired in violence and addiction. But when he left northern New Mexico for Albuquerque, Joseluis still fell into addiction, he said, because communities of color and land-based communities are facing the same realities now, no matter where they're at. He eventually lost his job and ended up homeless and living in his car. And then the smoke started to clear.
Ultimately, I landed up at this organization called Los Jardines Institute. And it was actually through there that I started to unpack the truth of my history, my ancestors, my community. Start to see how beautiful our people actually are, how resilient and how powerful our culture is. And then I started to heal. And one of the projects they do there is agriculture. And I grew up farming. My grandparents, my grandfather, my grandmother here in Dixon, they grew, probably more than 40 acres of land, and they maybe only at the time maybe only owned a couple acres. So that speaks to the land loss. But that was something that I could fall into as far as skills. So I started helping to create a sustainable system that was a farm. It was a volunteer-based organization, so it was all, I was just volunteering. I think the most I ever got paid there was like $300 a month, which covered a small part of the rent that I had when I finally found a place to live. Um, but I was exposed to environmental and economic justice. And the history of that movement is rooted in northern New Mexico. A lot of people don't know that. And it's tied to La Academia de la Nueva Raza, and how past generations were really laying out the groundwork for us to, understand this sense of self identity. And then I landed up overcoming my addiction and um, getting clean, um, and working at another organization where cultural healing was sort of the core piece of work, and it was about supporting young people and their families who were impacted by addictions and violence and gang participation, helping them connect to their core rooted culture as a pathway to healing. For me, that like hyper skyrocketed my pathway to healing. At that point, I was already overcoming the addiction, but I still didn't know who I was entirely. And um, once I realized how incredibly powerful our culture and our traditions were, then I was able to see how resilient our elders and our ancestors were. And then I started asking questions, and some of those questions were like, who are we? Where do we come from?
In the last two-part episode, we spent pretty much the whole time talking about how while the Spanish were going around telling everyone else how dubious their descent was, it was all because Spanish identity was the real construct. It was the real illusion. La Academia, which Joseluis began to learn about, had its origins in Dixon, New Mexico, where he grew up, and it gave him the framework to start asking questions of his family. He learned on his mother's side that he had indigenous grandmothers who stopped speaking their language. He learned of the kiva that sits beneath the Dixon church, and he began planting corn that had been planted since time immemorial.
And it was through that journey of discovering my identity that I realized that that is really at the core of our struggle is we don't know who we are, so we have no place or space. We're a place-based, space-based people with no place or space. We're essentially homeless in our own homeland, landless in our own homeland. And what that does for someone, especially a young person, to not have no place, it like you get lost so easy. And it's no wonder our people fall into gangs, because gang culture is a replacement to our real culture, and when our culture was erased, it's easy to go into gang culture, because you have the sense of community, you have initiation ceremonies, you have a process of family, mission and vision to look towards, and those were all things that we lost in our core way of being that drastically changed. I mean, I can say it changed a lot in the last 50 years, like super changed, and then before that in the previous 50 years, um, with technology and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that has been sort of the reason why I decided to move back home, was to come back home, live a traditional land-based way of life, leave behind corporate Americanized success, and be a farmer.
It's literally impossible for young people to become a farmer, because the truth is there isn't a shovel left behind or a piece of land, Joseluis said. Well, there is a long tradition of land-based living in which communities frame their spiritual systems, whether Catholicism or otherwise, around the land, the seasons, and water. There were actually very few spaces to do that kind of work. The barriers to even starting planting a garden in Dixon were legion. There were so many waves of land loss in his community, whether to Americanization, land speculation, taxes, or the incursion of hippies into small communities, that knowing what land was even available was the first of many obstacles. I can relate to this too. Not only is there a photograph of Janis Joplin sitting in front of my great-grandmother's house because she lived in Truchas for a time, but the bus that belonged to the commune, the hog farm, is still rusting away in an area we call Llano Quemado. Those hippies used to bathe in the acequia, sin vergüenza, as my great-grandmother always said. My mom still laments how much land was sold for so cheaply during this era.
In those late 1800s, the land speculators gave away our land to individuals, and then those individuals sold the land right back to those land speculators' companies, and they created these sort of proxy companies called pole and tie companies. And then they came in and clear cut our mountains, and they shipped all of that wood to the Panama Canal. And that's the story of the Santa Barbara land grant. That's the story of this watershed, that the rivers were dammed, the wood was cut, it was sent down the Rio Grande, put on a railroad, and sent to Panama. That's globalization, right? Those are those powers that be, the global powers that took us out of gardens, put us in the mountain to strip the mountains of the wood, the old growth resource, pulled all that resource. Then, when it was done and there was no more wood in the mountains, um, Americanization happened. People were moving out to the cities to work on the track, to go and work the agricultural fields in Colorado, industrial agriculture, conventional agriculture. We had those skills, so we were a perfect labor force. Modern day slavery pulled us away from home. We all have that story of how our abuelitos left to either on the borrega or on the pisca, right? So ranches at home were not being cultivated anymore, and that's also the story of Dixon, my grandfather. When the first gringos came, or the first hippies, they'll call them, when they came here, my grandfather received them. It was in a time when the viejitos, all their kids were gone. This was 1960. There were no young people, middle-aged people in these towns, just like today. And the lands, the elders didn't have nobody that wanted to take over their land. So they were selling it, and they were selling it for cheap, like literally nothing, literally giving away the land. So in my family, before my grandmother, my grandfather bought back the land that they lost, they it was sold to other families, right? So in that Americanization, the elders sold the land, or they lost the land to taxes. Other families picked it up, lost it to taxes or to loss of culture, and then sold it. And if it wasn't newcomers from California, then they sold it to people from the community who had wealth. Well, my family, they grew all these fields that were in theirs and saved up every penny, and then landed up slowly buying pieces of land back.
It's kind of an incredible thing to think about. Forests here were clear cut to build the Panama Canal. Yet again, testament to the fact that as New Mexico was transforming from a territory into a state, it was perhaps only so because we were resource and labor rich, though cash poor. Joseluis mapped that removal of old growth forests to the beginning of climate change and global warming. Those lands had once been like rainforests with their own weather systems and growth to keep water cycles intact, he went on. And when that was lost, there was not enough water and land to sustain communities. It was easier to go work on a labor force in Colorado to pull weeds, or Wyoming to pull potatoes, than it was to work on your own land. He called it an attack on small farmers by industrial agriculture. And yet, when Joseluis spoke to me, it was from a 300-year-old adobe room. He had figured out how to go home to himself and his community, regardless.
And I've heard this so many times, so many different elders, like, um, my temple is my garden, right, or my farm. My church is the farm, and I think we extremely underestimate the power of land's capacity to connect us to source. Um, for me, it was the land that helped heal me, and it was a spiritual journey. Um, and I can go into the science because I've researched this and looked it up. When you touch the soil, microbes and fungi enter your skin and go into your bloodstream, flow to your brain, and create synapses and spark memory. And I'm always saying, like, in the garden, there's not a whole lot I can teach you. I'll just help you remember. And the garden itself will help you remember, right? All of this is already stored within our genetic memory because this is where we come from. Uh, a lot of what I teach for people is more of like, oh, I already knew that, or like, that makes sense type of, teaching, as opposed to like, wow, that's incredible. Um, and I think that speaks to the genetic memory. How all of that relates to spirit, I think it's all one and the same. Right? Is when we're continuing a tradition, when we're planting seeds, when we're touching the earth, our body feels it physically. Our heart is beating, but also subconsciously, spiritually, there's a sense of security when you're planting seeds. There's a sense of knowing. When you take a seed and you plant it in the ground, it's a prayer, and then you cultivate that prayer and it germinates, it's an answered prayer. And then to keep it growing, it's a prayer. When you irrigate it, it's a prayer. And then when it fruits or flowers, that's an answered prayer. And then you take that fruit to maturity, it's a prayer. The energy you put into it, the sweat, the blood, it's a prayer. And then when you harvest, it's an answered prayer. So it's this series of prayer and answered prayer that ultimately connects us, to source, and spiritually provides this sense of security. I would say it is no wonder why we have anxiety, depression, and all these other mental health issues, because we are so nutritionally and culturally insecure, because we're not participating in the growing of our own food. We're not engaging in land-based ways that connect us to source. Nature being that source, nature being the guiding force to our spiritual connection.
At the heart of indigeneity, Joseluis said, is to know where to harvest osha, where traditional medicines can be found, and how to live with a deep sense of querencia. To know that Dia de San Isidro, for instance, is when the season is ripe for planting corn, and when the moon is in perfect alignment. Planting practices that look Catholic, he said, are actually indigenous at their core. Being indigenous for him is both a matter of blood and culture.
And this element is what really helped me sort of root in my knowing and place in space is the healing powers of the land, right? And going back to the way things were in terms of the diet that we eat, and the practice and engagement that we have with our traditional indigenous agricultural traditions, cultures, and practices. I think part of the medicine for our healing is taking that leap of faith, is having trust in nature and growing our own food. And even if it's a couple plants, getting into the practice of planting a seed, watching it grow, harvesting its fruit, saving its seed, and planting it again is a it's a practice, it's a life way that will root us into our truth, into our roots, and it'll inspire our genetic memory. It'll re-nourish our bodies with traditional nutrient dense nutrition, so that we can be our fullest potential. If we were able to eliminate all things colonial from our diet, or at least all things chemical, if we went back to eating more corn, beans, and squash that are organic, a lot of people say organic food is too expensive. Well, that's just not true. What's too expensive is our diet, right? And if we shifted and ate more bean protein, more squash, beans, corn, chili, and all of our traditional crops, I truly believe, and through my own experience, that we will detox from these chemicals, will shed off these illnesses like depression, anxiety, cancer, diabetes. We'll start to live longer. We'll start to operate at our fullest, greatest potential. We'll be able to tap into our genetic memory and have a sense of peace, a sense of well-being, and through that be able to exercise our cultural and life self-determination. And that's how we heal. That's how we move into the future.
Now you're talking sense.
Got this pine cone in my brain, got my eyes open, I'm saying it's that wake up, that breaking free for them.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Tilt Unsettled. This episode was produced by Iglesias with interviews by Diego and post-production by Christian. Our theme song is rapper Wake Self's Holy Water. It can be found on his posthumous album, Ready to Live. Unsettled is a 9-part series. Keep listening on our website at sfai.org or the SFAI channel at podbean.com. This project is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Arts.
I'm reaching holy water. Yeah, bump in the trunk. Third eye opened up. Third eye opened up. Bump in the trunk. Third eye opened up. Third eye opened up. Keep it alkaline. Keep it alkaline. Keep it alkaline. Keep it alkaline.